the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
The ad aired on the night of September 7th, 1964, in the midst of Monday night at the movies on NBC. The show was David and Bathsheba, and it only aired one time. It aired one time, 60 seconds, and they never paid for another airing of it. In the 1964 presidential election, it was Lyndon Johnson running for a full term, and his Republican opponent was Barry Goldwater, Republican senator from Arizona. It came about in the research that that Johnson's campaign, the Democratic National Committee, and the advertising firm that they hired, Doyle Dane Bernbach, a very up-and-coming, prominent advertising firm from New York, it came out of the research they did and the thinking and the talking that they did about where's Goldwater vulnerable, where can we go after him. Initially they thought it was going to be civil rights because Goldwater had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But that issue sort of faded. Then they thought maybe it might be Vietnam, the Vietnam War, but neither candidate was really interested in talking about Vietnam at that time. So it came down to Goldwater's statements about nuclear weaponry. And Goldwater had made so many reckless remarks. For example, he had joked about lobbing a missile into the men's room at the Kremlin after Kennedy had talked about sending a man to the moon. He said, I don't want to send a missile to the moon, I want to send one to the Kremlin. He said that we ought to consider using nuclear weapons to defoliate the jungles of South Vietnam. He said the nuclear bomb is merely another weapon, and then he said what he said about his position about NATO commanders in the field being able to make the unilateral decision to use nuclear weapons. So there was a lot to work with there when it came to nuclear weapons, and so it was almost in a sense a no-brainer. This is an issue that we must talk about, especially given the atmosphere of the fear that people still had about the prospect for a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. That election was played out less than 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when most people in the world thought that we were on the brink of nuclear war, and in the United States and Russia, nuclear annihilation. And so there was a lot of fear about the impact of nuclear war, potential war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There was the whole fear of the impact of nuclear fallout from the testing that the United States and the Soviet Union were doing, atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and there had been a nuclear test ban treaty passed. And so there was a lot of fear about nuclear war, and while not the only issue, it was a very big and overriding issue that had played out in American politics for the years leading up. Goldwater didn't respond immediately. He waited a little while and Goldwater himself, at least in public, didn't make a big deal about it. He condemned it, but didn't dwell on it, and I think probably wisely so. But the Republican Party, the Senate Republican leader Everett Dirksen, the chairman of the Republican Party, and a number of people associated with Goldwater's campaign expressed their outrage, filed official complaints with the Fair Campaign Practices Commission, called on the networks not to run it again, and really made quite a stink about it. And the Johnson campaign sort of magnanimously, or people around Johnson sort of magnanimously said we're not going to run it again. Of course, they never, best I can tell, never really planned to run it again. But I think it can be argued that Johnson's campaign was hoping for the reaction that they got from the Republican Party. They wanted to draw attention to the spot, and because of the outrage that sort of came on that Tuesday and Wednesday after the spot ran, all three major television networks aired the spot in its entirety later in the week. So for an expenditure of $25,000–$30,000, probably roughly 100 million people saw the spot, either when it was paid for or when it was shown on the newscasts. The lore of that spot is that it destroyed Goldwater's campaign. And in fact, if you look at the Gallup polls, before the campaign, Johnson was at about 68% of the polls, Goldwater was at 29%. A month later, after that spot had aired and after a number of other spots had aired attacking Goldwater's position on nuclear war and peace in general and a lot of other issues where Goldwater was vulnerable, a month later, Goldwater actually dropped not at all. He was still at 29%. Johnson had dropped to 64. So after all of that month of a barrage of negative spots against Goldwater, it was actually Johnson's numbers that went down, not Goldwater's. As best I can tell, there was no specific polling about the spot. You might more than likely you would do that today. In fact, you would probably, any campaign before airing something that unusual and shocking would probably have convened a number of focus groups and done a lot of research. The Johnson people and DDB, the ad firm, didn't appear to know what the reaction would be. And so there was quite a bit of reaction, but it was sort of all anecdotal. There were a lot of phone calls to the White House. Mostly it was people that were sort of shocked and aghast at this little girl picking daisies who was consumed by a nuclear blast. But there were, and then there were the predictable cries of outrage from the Republican Party and the Goldwater campaign about it. But it's hard to say what the public's response was to it, because as best I can tell, and I could not find any evidence that anyone had polled specifically about that spot, even though 50 million people saw it, and it would have probably been very easy to conduct a poll and find out what it was. They didn't do that, and perhaps it's because they never planned to air it again, so why poll it? You look at the spots that Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee for president in 1952 and 1956, and you look at the spots that Kennedy ran in 1960, and you look at Goldwater spots in 1964, they all look pretty much the same. So Goldwater, while Johnson was revolutionizing political advertising, Goldwater's campaign was really kind of stuck in the past. Goldwater spots were mostly him just looking to the camera, talking to the voters. So there's a little bit of a production quality to it, but not much. And they weren't nearly as creative as Johnson's were. And so in that sense, Goldwater was sort of stuck in 1956, 1960 style of campaigning, while Johnson was really revolutionizing politics. And so you look at the spots that Johnson ran and the spots that Goldwater ran, and you'd never guess they were from the same year. I do think it did one thing, and the polling evidence supports this, that it didn't persuade people not to support Goldwater, because his support was already pretty low, and what support he had was pretty solid and hardcore, and it wasn't really going anywhere. What it did do, I think, was solidify for a lot of independents, swing voters, who might have been thinking about either not voting for Johnson or possibly voting for Goldwater or not voting at all. It persuaded them that, not that Goldwater was a dangerous man, they already sort of understood that, but it raised their fear that if Goldwater was elected president, that there would likely be a war between the Soviet Union and the United States. So it raised not so much fears about Goldwater, but it raised fears that if Goldwater was elected, that there would be a war. There was a much greater likelihood there would be a war. And so that's really the main impact it had. It baked in those negative views that people had of Goldwater, and it raised fears that if he were elected, that there would be a war. But in the end, you look at the polling from the beginning of the campaign to the end of the campaign, it didn't really change that much. So it's hard to really argue that that spot and the others that Johnson aired really did anything to Goldwater, because you would have to argue that Goldwater was really viable in the first place, and I don't believe that he was. I don't know if you'd see an ad like this again. I find it amazing, actually, that Lyndon Johnson, among the most sort of conservative of politicians when it came to sort of his personal business and his politics, would agree to air a spot like this. It was so new and different and revolutionary in its style and its tone. It is kind of remarkable that Johnson did this, but in doing it, I think that he did participate in changing the way that American politicians communicated with the public through their paid advertising, because before then it was a completely different style of advertising. It was not very creative. It was mostly 15-minute and 30-minute speeches, just the candidate looking into the camera, talking, maybe sitting behind a desk, on the edge of a desk. Very low production quality to it. Very little spot advertising. So most campaigns did not rely on the 15, 30, 60-second spots. They relied on these longer broadcasts when they were preempting television shows instead of putting the spots inside television shows. And so this campaign showed political advertisers how to do it a different way. Spot advertising and using creative advertising principles, actually thinking like advertising a product, advertising a candidate like you would a car or a box of cereal or a bar of soap. And that was the real innovation, I think, that this campaign brought to political advertising, was those creative advertising principles. Suddenly we're now a part of political advertising, and the rest is history, because that aspect of political advertising has only grown and expanded over the years.